So that'll only put us a day behind, but with the exam, remember the exam is currently scheduled for Wednesday, October 5th. So that would still leave us a full week to talk about the last reading before the exam, which is the Quine reading. The Quine reading easily repays a week worth of attention, if not more. But a week should be a reasonable amount of time to get into some of the big issues that it raises. So I think we'll still be all right schedule-wise. Sound good to everybody? And then the second submission deadline is coming up the end of next week. Is that 30th? The 30th? Yeah. Okay. I know I've talked to several folks about second submissions already. I'm going to have a few more discussions coming up. But if anyone has any questions, please do reach out and let me know. Remember, with the first ones, I tried to give minimal feedback because I kind of wanted to see where everybody was at. But starting with the second submission deadline, I'm happy to kind of discuss in more detail individual assignments with you. Okay? All right. So, what I want to do today, next on the list of overambitious agendas, is talk a little bit more about the Armstrong, because I think that I was happy to talk about the unicorn example as long as we did the last couple of days, but I want to circle back around now to some of the details of the Armstrong, which is what got us started on that, and then tie it to the Kozlicki paper, look at a couple of specific arguments in the Kozlicki paper, and then I think we'll be in good shape. It doesn't sound like that much when I say it that way, right? Okay, so let's give it a shot. So what I want to focus on today, at least to start with, are a couple of things. So in the background of all of this that we've really been talking about for the last several days is our old friend, the argument from truth and predication. A bit of a long one to spell out here, but let me get it down so that we've got it. Sometimes having my slides is kind of nice. Okay, here. All right, so remember the idea, and we found kind of suggestion of this in our original Russell reading, is that we begin with simple observations. That, right, we say true things about the world. We say very simple true things about the world. Tally is a dog. WVU is in Morgantown. All sorts of things like that. And the thought is the best explanation of these simple truths, right, that we can utter true things in this way, has two parts. The first part, and I'm not sure that we've really kind of emphasized this super explicitly, it's come up tangentially a few times, right? There are two parts to the explanation. The first part is what we can call a semantic hypothesis. It's a claim about the meanings of the sentences that we use to say true and false things, right? That it's a kind of fundamental fact about what this sentence means. The sentence Tally is a dog. That its kind of job in communication and all of that is to pick out a particular individual, Tally, and attribute some property to her. Right? And then the thought is, of course, that different parts of the sentence are doing those separate jobs, right? So there's a kind of deep hypothesis about how language and meaning work buried in this argument, right? And then there's a kind of metaphysical claim. And so, similarly, we can talk about why the sentence Tally is a cat is false. The explanation will, have a semantic hypothesis. That sentence attributes to Tally the property of being a cat, but then she doesn't have that property. So that's what makes the sentence false in that case. All right. We haven't talked about this argument in a few days, but I'm hoping this is mostly familiar. Any relatively quick questions or observations about it? Jamie had a good frown going there for a sec.
I'm good right now.
Okay.
Right now I'm good.
Okay.
I see it says attributes to Tally, and then I can't really read after that.
Attributes to Tally the property of being a dog.
Okay.
And. Good. Okay. So now I realize it's been probably a few days since you looked at the Armstrong, but we can call it up if you need to or dig deep in your memory. What does Armstrong think of this argument? And maybe, less, think less about the specific instance here and more about this kind of argument very generally. Lizzie, was that a hand or?
No.
Okay, just checking. What does Armstrong think about this argument? Does anybody have a copy of the Armstrong reading either with them or in front of them? Yeah, Taylor?
Yeah.
You said you do? If you find page 73, you see that? It's the one that's got the funny little diagram with the capital.
Yeah.
So below that stuff, there's a paragraph that begins, let's see, do we want to do that? Yeah. I do not think. You see that paragraph? Would you mind reading at least the first couple sentences of that one to us?
Yeah. I do not think that there is any infallible way of deciding what are the true universals. It seems clear that we must not look to semantic considerations. As I said in section 1 of this chapter, those who argue to particular universals from semantic data, from predicates to a universal corresponding to that predicate, argue in a very optimistic and unempirical manner.
Good. Perfect. Good intuitions about when to pause. All right. So what's he saying here? What is Armstrong getting at? Yeah.
Like predication in language isn't enough to, he doesn't like this argument, so it's not enough to, conclude the existence of universals.
Yeah, he doesn't like this argument, and in particular, he seems to be calling into question, the semantic hypothesis that we make in the explanation. Now, we can tie this to our earlier discussion, right? One way to see that he questions this semantic hypothesis is that he's going to say, well, now, wait a minute here. Here's another true sentence. Jewel is a unicorn, right? That's true. But we're not going to say that, right, at least if you're Armstrong, you're not going to say that what makes that true is that there's a thing out there, Jewel, that has the property of being a unicorn. So at least in some cases of simple true statements where we predicate something of a subject, there's got to be some other explanation. And if we've got that other explanation, then why the hell do we need this one even in this case? Does that make sense? I'm going to pause. So I think this is a really interesting argument that's raising some questions that we've kind of touched on in different ways, but we haven't really, I think, called out on the table yet. Yeah, Cal.
Is it like saying the words "the property of being a dog" doesn't show us anything about the universal that's involved?
It's that, right? It's that in saying this,
Yeah.
right? We're assuming that there's such a property, and that's how we have to explain the truth of this sentence.
Mm-hmm.
But that's already kind of assuming what we want to know. Are there universals in the first place? Does that make sense? Does that kind of jive with what you were getting at? Okay, good. Yeah. Hayden, is that a thought? A beard-scratching thought?
Not really developed.
Okay. All right. Yeah, I'll go ahead.
Is he almost saying that language just refers to itself?
Well, so I don't think he's going that far, right? But I think he is asking that kind of question, right? The general question here, which is one, again, that we've sort of touched on, right? I mean, we can put the question this way, right? How and, that's an and, when are we justified in drawing metaphysical conclusions from, and I'll just say linguistic premises or observations. Oops. That's it. All right, so I'm not sure he's himself kind of trying to say how language works.
But he's like asking the question.
He's asking the question, right? Why should we think that the only way to explain how language works requires that every time we, say something about an object, there has to be some universal that corresponds to what we're saying about that object? That's the challenge. So one example of a way that this came up, and I think this is I just want to kind of put this out there for illustration, because I think it is a tempting move sometimes. So several weeks ago, I think when we were still reading Russell, I think it was Heider and Cow who were kind of pushing the idea that there is a universal of I-ness or something, right? And the thought there seemed to be, right, you were kind of talking about basic features of the word I and trying to draw from that conclusions about what universals exist and don't exist. And, the question right now is not, was that a good way to argue in this case, but I just want to point out that it kind of illustrates this question. How do we get from observations or intuitions about our language to claims about what exists? Now, I think Taylor and Jordan, it looked like you may have been thinking about something. Did you have a thought? Oh, okay. Taylor, go ahead.
Yeah. It just seems to me like he's taking more of a observational approach, because he said that it was very optimistic and unempirical, and so I guess he just thinks language alone is just baseless.
Yeah.
So we should be able to see it, touch it. I don't know.
Yeah, it's. I think his. Again, he's not going to tell us how language works, but I think he is going to say it's probably messy, right? And so we've got to be really careful in just sort of blithely going from language to ontology. And instead, what does he think we should do instead to finish that passage, Taylor? Do you want to read the rest of that paragraph?
He says, argue in a very optimistic and unempirical manner. I call them a priori realists. Better, I think it is a posteriori realism.
Yeah.
The best guide that we have to just what universals are is total science.
Yeah, and you actually dropped a small but important word in there. What universals there are.
There are.
Yes, all right. What universals exist, right? How do we know? It's what science tells us exists. And of course, if you're Armstrong and you accept the principle of instantiation, that's it. Instantiation. I have no idea if I spelled that right. All right, so sciences tell us how to chunk up the world, and that tells us what universals there are. And all of those universals exist in space and time, right? And so we are comfortable within, right? This is another term that we actually haven't used here, but that's important to Armstrong, is the view he calls naturalism. And this is the view that everything that exists has to be in space and time. Yeah.
So it's basically there's a reality, there's a world before language, and that world is the true world. And the only way to know what is true is through an indifferent sort of scientific, purely, in this way, outlook.
Empirical observation. That seems to be the picture that Armstrong has given us.
Okay.
Yep. Good. What do we think about that? All right. Jordan likes it.
I love naturalism. Right now we're talking.
But notice, right? But I do want to point out that you may agree with Armstrong about that, but he wants to say that you can have your naturalist cake and eat your universals too, right?
I think he just needs to go further.
Yeah, Taylor.
So I like this argument because then he talks about like the type red and the type forest will like still
Yeah.
exist because they're part of the natural world. But where do concepts like love and justice, where do those fall for him?
That was going to be my question.
Yeah.
You're on great.
Yeah. So obvious questions for naturalism include, right, moral properties, and I don't know, what shall we call them? Emotional properties, emotions, something like that.
Social.
Emotional.
So it doesn't seem fair just to discount them completely, even though this seems like a pretty good argument for like the unicorn case.
Good. Yeah, so these are fundamental questions for naturalism, and I think very good ones to address. I don't know. Ask Dan. ask Dr. Miller. I don't know. Ask Devin. Just punting a lot here at this point, but.
Ask if they're busy on Monday.
That would be fun. That's a good idea. We will talk a little about these when, right, that is going to be exactly the topic of the Mills paper. But, right, so each of these at this point, right, we kind of now can see there's a lot going on in questions of meta-ethics. And, yeah. Sometimes it's called moral psychology, sometimes it's just part of philosophy of mind, but it's a whole subfield of philosophy right now. And then social and political philosophy is also a whole thing, but the metaphysics of it is something that's really only received more attention, to my knowledge, in the last 25 and 30 years because of some of the people that we have read and will read, like Haslanger and Mills. Anders had a hand for me? No? Okay.
Okay, so when we're talking about these three different categories, is it like, should we separate like sadness and happiness from like justice, or should we just consider it all together?
That's
Okay.
itself a good question, right? I
Yeah.
mean, so I believe some philosophers are going to try to ground moral notions in basic,
Yeah.
right, emotional responses to things.
Okay. It
But
makes
others
sense to me
will.
to just group them together, but.
Yeah, but others won't. And so, right, so that too that's part of the philosophical morass that we get into here, is how even these categories are related to one another. Right? And one of the things that we may pick up on in the Mills, I can't remember is if he's as explicit about it as Haslanger is, but for Haslanger, these two are inextricably bound up with one another, the moral and the social. And so it's very hard to talk about one without the other. Let's see, Ethan and then Kate.
Wouldn't you kind of be able to connect like emotional concepts into like the natural world by using like science? Like, you know, you have these chemical impulses in your brain
Good.
that, you know, correspond to certain emotions.
Good. Yeah, so it may be that some of these are more amenable to the kind of methods that Armstrong favors than others. That's absolutely right. I'm not going to try to adjudicate that
Right.
here, but I think that is a good question. It certainly seems like a research project in psychology that many people are in fact engaged in. So I think that's a absolutely good point. Yeah. Abe?
Maybe this is completely like irrelevant, but what would be like kind of the opposite of this view? Like if there's a metaphysical view, kind of, I guess, opposite or supposing something different than that. Because I feel like it's a bit naive to say everything that science tells us exists does exist for sure, nothing else. I mean,
Yeah, I mean, that. So you mean, so what would you, so I mean, there are people who are called moral realists, and that might mean that you think that there are kind of inescapably moral facts or something like that, so there's some inescapable property of goodness that you can't just analyze in non-moral terms, right?
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we'll see next week, right, that there are kind of irreducibly social kinds, and that we're kind of missing. The interesting thing is that, right, that may actually drive here to some extent, because the thought is we're missing a complete picture of the world we live in if we don't take into account the importance of these kind of social kinds, these socially determined and created groups. Yeah. All right, good deal. So I think in the background here is, though, I think a further point, and this is what leads us to the Kozlicki argument, right? Because there is this, at the very least, even if we don't go as far as Aiden, you were describing it, like science is it, right? There does seem to be reasons to favor privilege, perhaps, the sort of kinds of categories and groupings that the natural and perhaps social sciences gives us. And so I think in the background we can maybe, right, so Armstrong realized, and this is bullshit, but maybe in the background there's a different argument. Let's call it the argument, and here I'm going to use a word that Armstrong doesn't directly, but that figures centrally in the Kozlicki reading, right? And this is going to connect up, I think, some of your observations nicely. So, let me see, how do I make sure I say this coherently? I have it in the slide, so I'm going to just make sure I have my... Yeah, that's how I want to put it. All right. So, to try to put it neutrally, we'll say this. The categories of our best scientific theories. Come on, Jordan. Right, our objective. This is, I think, kind of capturing Cal's idea that the world is there before language in some sense, right? P2, what do we say? The best explanation of this is that these categories correspond to universals, so of course there are universals. All right. So this is yet a different argument to the best explanation from the original three that we've discussed. So we've discussed the argument from attribute agreement, which we'll come back to. We've discussed the argument from abstract nouns, which probably doesn't fare much better than this one for Armstrong because that's an explicitly semantic idea, right? And so we know that Armstrong is not going to be happy about that kind of thing. So that one was no good. And the argument from truth and predication. Of those three, the only one that Armstrong seems to have any sympathy with is the argument from attribute agreement. But in the background, I think we can see Armstrong as thinking something along these lines. So what do we think about this argument? How does this... Any thoughts, questions, observations here? Yeah, Aiden, go ahead.
Is it kind of almost the same thing because social kinds are kind of like a convention that we use, it seems like, if I'm correct with Kozlicki, like...
Say a little bit more.
So he rejects that argument because of mainly the semantic hypothesis that kind of language isn't necessarily accurate.
Yeah.
Insofar as the existence of universals are concerned. But also here, it seems like, much like language is a convention, social kinds are kind of a useful way for us to kind of group up things in the world.
So are you restricting this challenge to social kinds? Because Kozlicki doesn't really talk about social kinds too much. But I think you are getting at something really important in the Kozlicki reading. Because there's something about this argument that I think is a little different from the first three arguments to the best explanation that we've met, where it doesn't quite fit the pattern as well. If you remember the pattern of an argument to the best explanation, you want to begin with a kind of neutral or innocent observation. Come on, brain. It's Friday. Right? And then try to explain what we take to be, again, an innocent or neutral observation. Everybody see that? But now there's a question. Is this an innocent observation or not? What do we think about that? Jackie, does that question make sense? Yeah? Yeah? Louis, does it make sense, the kind of question I'm asking you? How do you see how this seems like a more controversial thing to say right up front than this does? I say shit like this all the time and I'm not too worried about it, but it seems like, yeah.
Because scientists learn and correct different things all the time.
Good.
So I feel like that's very restrictive to say that.
Okay, good. Yeah, right? Yeah, how are we justified in saying this when scientists could turn around tomorrow and say, oh, we were wrong. Pluto is a planet. Yeah, sorry about that, Pluto. Let's see, Cal and then Taylor. Taylor, did you have a hand? No?
Maybe.
Okay. Cal, go ahead.
It's not really the same type of predications in the first place. In the first ones, there was a subject and there was something attached to it. But
Yeah.
Here, it's not really the same. It's like making it an assertion rather than just saying something is something and it's true.
Yeah, good. I mean, that's, of course, this is a little bit of an artifact of this argument. Think about the argument from attribute agreement where we just begin with an observation. Here are two things that seem a lot alike, right? And that's meant to be a very innocent observation. Now, it's not the same kind of observation as that one, but, right? So I don't know, is that, maybe I missed something in what you were getting at. Were you,
No, I'm just saying it's not really an observation. Like it's actually an observation.
Yeah.
Like that's just kind of like you're just saying that.
Good, yeah, good. Yeah, Jake.
And best is also subjective. Like what do they even mean by that?
Yeah, that's a good question. Ask Devin. but I mean, presumably we can say something like, right, the categories of our sort of, current theories that have held up best to repeated empirical tests, and sort of generate broad consensus among the scientific community that's the kind of thing we're after when we're talking about best, right? The idea that to the extent that, right, the kind of social activity of science has extreme self-correction and criticism built in, kind of the point we're making about Pluto anyway, right? That's actually part of what does this, and that's what we mean by best, is the thing that people agree on when they're in their most kind of reflective and critical frames of mind, right, among, at least as scientists. So I think that's a good question, but that would be my ballpark answer. I don't think Devin would totally disagree with me, but we can always check. Let's see, Kyle, go ahead.
Well, now I started thinking about the best, and it's like, if you say something is the best, at least as far as science is concerned, you're saying that there's observations that can't be categorized by that theory. And if that's the case, then science is always in contention. Therefore, if you're claiming that a scientific category is a universal, but you're pointing to the best science, then you're saying that some observations fall outside of that universal when it should be universal. So it would point to the fact that there's a universal, quote unquote, like more universal than the ones you're working with. So I still see this as a problem of the semantic hypothesis.
So I confess you lost me at the very first step of that argument. Why does talking about our best scientific theory
If you
entail?
need to qualify it as best, you're admitting that we don't have the perfect theory of everything. Like otherwise we would just say like the theory. But there's always contestation in science, according to the fact we don't have.
That's absolutely right. But
so whatever best is always just like, temporal. So you can't jump to universal after you're working within something temporal.
so, okay, I think I understand the challenge, just that, right, we're still worried about, why I think this is true, right? That's your ultimate question. Why I think this premise is true. Is that right? That's your worry?
Yeah.
Yeah. This is, right. Is there someone, Quincy, is that, you sure? Jordan, yeah.
Well, it's also going after premise one. Even if you would consider the best scientific theories themselves to be objective, that doesn't justify as well as the categories themselves. Because I feel like with the categories, you still cannot escape the socialization problem. About how it could just be we as humans, because we're the ones doing the science. If we ourselves are making categories for scientific theories, it's still not escaping the social problem.
Good. I think that's a really good challenge. There are, it seems to me, two ways to take that challenge, and I think only one of them is damaging to the argument. The other gives us just the weaker conclusion that we're missing some things, right? So you might think, so the strong version is something like this, right? Our human biases, right, are infecting our empirical observations in ways where we're seeing what we want to see, and so making the generalizations we want to make, right? And so, right, the categories that we come up with ultimately just reflect our own desires and biases and what have you. That's a very strong version of the objection. A different version of the objection is that our biases may kind of lead us to focus on certain categories over others, right? In which case, we can conclude that we may be missing some interesting generalizations about the world, But it doesn't follow that the generalizations that we arrive at aren't objective. Do you see what I mean? And so how could we, right, what argument could we give to privilege the stronger, more skeptical conclusion over the weaker one is an interesting question. I'm not sure I know. Okay. What does Kozlicki think about that premise? Because this is where very directly these papers or readings tie into one another. Or at least, what does she say about it? Right, so what she's talking about here, right, when we talk about the categories of our best scientific theories, this is, right, a lot of people use the word natural kinds for exactly this notion. Oh, it's booby-trapped. So when we talk about natural kinds, think of, right, things like copper, or more generally, metals, right? So natural kinds are groupings of things in the world. They seem to form a hierarchy, that's part of it, right? So in biology, there's dogs and cats and all of that, but those are all grouped together under a broader category of mammal, etc. All right, so things that have that kind of structure are the kinds of things that we're interested in here. What does Kozlicki, what does she say? Anything at all about these kinds of categories? Yeah.
Does she think that, well, I think she would endorse premise 1.
Good, yeah. I think she would. And I think she identifies 3 arguments for premise 1, specifically. What? Or at least we can chop up what she says into 3 separate arguments. What? Yeah, what would be one of them?
I'm just looking at the reading right now.
Yeah.
I mean, I have a sentence here. She says, natural kinds are best construed as not arbitrary, heterogeneous, or gerrymandered. So, like, they're objective in some sense. They're real.
Good. Yeah. Where is that? What page are you on?
That's like page 3 of the PDF.
Good.
Right under the abstract, pretty much. That's
Yeah. Good.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And so, good. So let's skip down to the start of section 2. So you see section 2, the special features,
Yeah.
Want to read that first paragraph of that section, Aiden?
Yeah. It starts with how then.
Yeah.
Okay. How then are natural kinds to be distinguished from non-natural kinds? And what motivates our belief in the existence of natural kinds in general and of certain specific natural kinds in particular? Those who take a realist rather than a conventionalist line on natural kinds, that is, those who are of the opinion that the natural-non-natural distinction points to a substantive contrast, are typically motivated in their belief in the existence of natural kinds by the role these kinds play in 1, induction and prediction,
Good catch.
2, the laws of nature, and 3, causal explanation.
All right, so what's Kozlicki saying here? Right, when she talks about the natural, non-natural distinction, does anybody have a sense of what she means by that? Would be an example of a non-natural kind. Yeah.
Maybe like robots or something, like.
Well, that might.
That we've made up. That.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting case. I think there can be even more like straightforward cases. Let's see, Lizzie and then Emma, I think.
Would religion count as a non-natural kind?
Ooh, that's a big one. That's an interesting question. It depends, I suspect, on whether you think there's, well, 2 things. 1, something we can call human nature, and 2, whether religious belief is a kind of necessary part of human nature. Both of those are open and controversial questions. But if you thought the answer to both was yes, then you might think that religion was a sort of natural kind. So that's a really interesting example. I'm
Yeah,
not
because
sure.
like in my mind, I feel like religion is something that didn't exist before humans existed.
Mhm.
Like, not necessarily that like humans quote unquote made up religion, because I believe that there's something bigger out there that is
Okay.
bigger than humankind. But I don't think like religion or any type of religion existed before humans. So that's why I'm kind of
Okay.
like,
Certainly, so maybe we can say it neutrally, something like this. Religious beliefs didn't exist before there were humans, right? Because there have to be humans around to have the beliefs. So maybe something like that. Let's see, Emma and then Skylar, I think. What was
Earlier
your-
in the reading, she had talked about, like, kind of the distinction, or like how it gets super tricky with things like pseudosciences, politically charged,
Yeah.
and then like non-respected sciences. So I guess like how does that play in? Because I really couldn't like figure out if she was really arguing that they were a natural kind or kind of science, or if they were.
Yeah, so I think that her ultimate, at that point, she's just kind of telling you, this is she's a philosopher. She's like, this is a tricky question. But I think her ultimate view, and this comes out with her discussion of chairs and weeds, if you remember that passage, is that the kind of boundary between what counts as a natural kind and what counts as a non-natural kind may actually be kind of fuzzy, right? There may be some sort of cases that are kind of in the middle, and who knows, maybe robots would be such a case, I'm not actually sure. And so I think that part of what she's getting at is that there are other cases where it may not be immediately obvious whether we're dealing with a natural kind or a non-natural kind. And maybe, politically charged social kinds raise a kind of example of that. And so I think that's the kind of thing she's getting at. Right? But she's also getting at, and this is important, that in the history of science there have been well-established scientific categories that we now don't recognize anymore, right? And so there is in the background this question that we've been wrestling with all along. Skylar, what were you thinking about?
I was thinking, she says natural kinds play a role in induction and prediction. So would non-natural come from like a priori knowledge? Would that be considered something?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. I don't think she would want to say that, but I don't know. I can see kind of how you get that. I think though that she's not using the induction prediction so much as a kind of marker, although in a sense she is, but she's using it more as a reason to think that there are such things. But still, that's a really interesting, but yeah, so are numbers a natural kind?
Yeah.
That's a really interesting question. I have no effing clue how to think about that. In some sense, I want to say yes, right? And I mean, in some sense, numbers work very well in induction. So that's really interesting. Okay, yeah. There's some simple examples, though. Yeah.
I mean, like like fictional things like monsters.
That's a good one. Here, I've got one for you that's even easier. Here's a kind. The shit on this table, right? That's a category of objects. It may even be one that's kind of useful to us at certain points. If I say, oh, hey, could you go grab everything on that table, right? We care about that category. But is there anything particularly natural linking all of these things together? I suppose they all belong to me. As it happens.
They're on the table.
Yeah. But now they don't belong to me, right? So there doesn't seem to be any natural phenomenon that we can really say unifies these into a group beyond the fact that I've put them on the table. So that would be, I think, a clear example of the kind of thing Kozlicki has in mind when she talks about a non-natural kind, a grouping of objects that doesn't track kind of fundamental divisions in the natural world. That got Jordan's going.
At least for the things on the able example, it does feel like there is a naturalistic part of that. Like either spatially, they're all within a certain length or distance between each other. They all are on the table, like on that specific table. So I feel like there are at least some aspects of it that are natural that you can't ignore.
I think that's absolutely right. I think that, you know, and if it was, you know, if I just had, say, a pile of puppies on the table, right, then we would recognize that the things on the table are very closely related to each other, right, because they belong to some more natural category. But it wouldn't be their being on the table that makes the category they belong to a more natural one. Does that make sense? And so, I mean, you're right. These all are physical objects. They all have a certain mass and size and whatnot. But that doesn't have anything to do with their being on the table. And so it doesn't make the category of things on the table a natural one. And this is, I knew I was too ambitious. But this is exactly the point of, in particular, the argument from induction and prediction. Right? Very quickly, right, she's going to draw a contrast between a claim like, you know, or a category like copper, where it seems like a pretty good argument to say, look, every piece of copper we've ever observed conducts electricity. So we're justified in concluding that every piece of copper, right, including those we haven't observed, conducts electricity. But now, I don't know, everything on this table right now weighs more than this, right? That's true, right? So are we justified in concluding that the next thing that we find on the table weighs more than this? No. Right? Inductive inferences behave very badly with a lot of our categories, but they seem to behave very well with categories that we take to be more natural. Does that make sense? That was a kind of quick sketch of her argument, but and then the argument from law-like generalizations is very similar. It's just, right, it's now consider not just unobserved copper, but consider, right, imagine that some new piece of copper comes to be in the universe, right? That copper, too, would still conduct electricity, assuming it's actually copper, right? So not just actual unobserved phenomena, but even possible cases seem to behave in regular ways when we recognize them as members of natural kinds, but not with kind of arbitrary groupings of objects. So those are two of the reasons that Kozlicki gives to defend this premise. All right, so it is more controversial. It's not meant to be quite the same level of observation, but there are arguments for it. All right, hot shit. That's about all I wanted to do today. So I think we're pretty good. So we are going to talk about the mills on whatever that thing is next, Monday. Have a good weekend, y'all. Now, are we meeting this afternoon?